Tonight, we open a door most would rather keep shut. This is not a tale of dragons or knights in shining armor. This is the other side of the Middle Ages, the cold, damp, iron-bound side, the side where justice wore a hood, and mercy was measured in how quickly you screamed. In this 2-hour journey, we'll walk through the real history of medieval torture. No myths, no Hollywood exaggeration, just the facts, documented, chilling, and sometimes stranger than fiction. And if you enjoy falling asleep to the darker corners of history, make sure to subscribe. And also tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? We love seeing how far our history travels. Now let's begin. The church bell rings. The iron door opens. Stone walls sweat with centuries of silence. A single torch flickers, casting long shadows across the damp floor. Chains rattle softly in the dark, and somewhere, beyond the heavy oak door, comes the sound of a muffled scream. Not loud, not panicked, just resigned. The kind of scream that knows no one is coming. You step inside. The air is thick with mildew and something older. Something like rust, but not quite. A wooden table sits in the center of the room, stained and worn. Beside it, a bucket, a rope, a crank, and in the corner, a hooded figure waits, not with rage, but with routine. This is not chaos. This is procedure. Because torture in the Middle Ages wasn't used all the time. But when it was artful. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Europe wasn't a non-stop parade of racks and iron maidens. Torture was regulated, technically. It was often reserved for the most serious crimes: heresy, treason, witchcraft. And even then, it was supposed to be used only when other methods failed. But when it was used, it wasn't random violence. It was deliberate, structured, almost choreographed. Interrogators were trained, not just in cruelty but in procedure. There were rules, grim ones. A confession extracted under torture had to be repeated later, voluntarily, without pain, to be considered valid. So the goal wasn't to kill, it was to break, to extract truth, or what sounded like it, to make the accused say what the court needed to hear, and to do it in a way that looked, on parchment, like justice. The tools were many. The strapado, where arms were tied behind the back, and the victim hoisted and dropped. The thumbscrew, which crushed inch by inch. The rack, of course. Slow, stretching agony. But these weren't just instruments of pain. They were instruments of persuasion. The tormentor wasn't always a snarling brute. Sometimes he was calm, methodical, even polite. Because this wasn't vengeance. It was inquiry, and the aim. Pain, confession, humiliation, not death at first. See, medieval torture wasn't always about ending someone's life. That would have been too quick, too final, and frankly, a bit wasteful. Death was the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. Torture. That was the paragraph. The long, agonizing, footnoted paragraph. The goal was to make you talk, cry, beg, and, if possible, sing like a canary with a law degree. And if you didn't, well, they just keep turning the crank. The accused were often stripped of dignity before they were stripped of skin. Public nudity, shaved heads, paraded through town in shame, because nothing says justice like being dragged through the mud while your neighbors throw turnips. And then came the real persuasion: the rack, the pier of anguish, the iron boot. Each device had a purpose, a rhythm, a reputation. Some were designed to stretch, others to crush. A few were just there to make you wish you'd never learned to speak. But here's the twist: most victims didn't die on the table. That wasn't the point. The point was to break them, just enough to get what the court wanted, then patch them up, send them back into the world, and let everyone else see what happened to those who crossed the line. Because in the end, they tortured not just to punish, but to terrify the rest. Because nothing says, don't steal a chicken. Like watching your neighbor get hoisted upside down with a rope tied to his ankles and a confession squeezed out like toothpaste. Medieval justice wasn't just about guilt, it was about theatre. A very painful, very public kind of theatre. And the audience. Everyone. Townsfolk, children, the local baker, even the guy who just came to sell turnips. You didn't need a courtroom sketch artist. You had front, row seats, and the smell of burning flesh to remember it by. The logic was simple. If one person screamed loud enough, maybe 10 others would think twice. It was less about reform and more about reputation. You didn't want to be known as the village that went soft on heretics. That's how you got plagues, or worse, papal disapproval. So they made examples. Big ones, loud ones, sometimes even musical ones, if you count the screams as part of the score. And the message was clear: step out of line, and you won't just suffer, you'll suffer creatively. Because medieval justice had flair. It had props, it had choreography, and it had a very firm belief that fear was the best deterrent. Which brings us to the real stars of the show, the laws themselves. Welcome to the law of the iron fist, a legal system where subtlety went to die. This wasn't about evidence or cross-examination. This was about ordeals, divine ones. Because when in doubt, let God sort it out. Trial by ordeal was the medieval version of let's see what happens. Couldn't decide if someone was guilty. No problem. Just have them plunge their hand into boiling water. If it healed nicely after 3 days, they were innocent. If it festered, guilty, and possibly dead. But hey, divine judgment isn't always gentle. Then there was trial by hot iron. Same idea, but with a glowing metal bar. Carry it a few paces, get bandaged, and wait. If your hand like it belonged to a saint afterward, congratulations, you were free to go. If it looked like a roasted ham, well, maybe you shouldn't have borrowed your neighbor's ox. And for those who preferred a bit more action, there was trial by combat. Yes, you could literally fight your way to innocence. 2 people enter, 1 person leaves, and God, presumably, picks the winner. It was like a legal system designed by a tavern bouncer. If you were rich or noble, you could even hire a champion to fight for you. Because nothing says truth like outsourcing your justice to a guy named Ulrich with a sword bigger than your horse. And through it all, God was the judge. Not metaphorically, literally. The whole system was built on the belief that divine intervention would reveal the truth. If you floated in the river, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. And hopefully someone remembered to pull you out. It was faith-based justice with a splash of waterboarding. So yes, they tortured to terrify. But they also judged with fire, steel, and the occasional duel to the death. Trial by ordeal, trial by combat, God as judge. It was a legal system built on faith, fear, and a complete lack of common sense. In the Middle Ages, if you were accused of a crime and didn't have a good alibi, or, say, a noble title, you didn't get a lawyer, you got a boiling cauldron, or a sword, or a red-hot iron bar. Because why bother with evidence when you can just ask God to weigh in? Trial by ordeal was the medieval version of let's see what happens. Couldn't prove your innocence? No problem. Just stick your hand in boiling water and pull out a stone. If your skin didn't blister like a roast chicken, congratulations! You were innocent. If it did, well, maybe you shouldn't have looked so suspicious in the first place. There was also the hot iron test. You'd carry a glowing metal bar a few paces, then get bandaged up like a medieval mummy. 3 days later, a priest would unwrap your hand and check the wound. If it looked clean, God had clearly intervened. If it looked like you'd lost a thumb to a campfire, well, divine justice had spoken. And then there was trial by combat. Because nothing says truth like two guys in chainmail trying to beat each other into a confession. If you were rich, you could hire a champion to fight for you. If you were poor, you had to swing the sword yourself and hope God liked your footwork. The winner was declared innocent, because obviously, God would never let a guilty man win a duel. Unless he was busy that day. This wasn't just law, it was performance art. A flaming, bruising bone, snapping spectacle of righteousness. And through it all, the church stood by, nodding solemnly, as if this all made perfect sense. Because in a world without fingerprints, DNA, or CCTV footage, justice had to come from somewhere. No forensic science, just bruises and blood. CSE Medieval Edition would have been a very short show. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fiber analysis. Just a guy with a torch, a suspicious goat, and a whole lot of guesswork. If someone turned up dead in the village square, the investigation usually went something like this. Who didn't like him? That guy? Alright, tie him up. Evidence. That was for future centuries. In the Middle Ages, if you had bruises, you were probably guilty. If you didn't have bruises, you were probably hiding something. And if you had blood on your hands, well, that was basically a confession, even if you were just a butcher. Context was optional. The local constable might examine the body, nod sagely, and declare, "Aha, blunt force trauma," which could mean anything from a mugging to a particularly aggressive sheep. And if the accused had a black eye or a limp, that was practically a signed affidavit. He looks roughed up. Must have been resisting arrest. Never mind that the arrest came after the roughing up. There were no labs, no autopsies, no chain of custody. Just a lot of assumptions and a very enthusiastic crowd. And if you tried to protest your innocence, well, that sounded suspicious too. Because in this world of bruises and blood, guilt was often assumed until disproven. In medieval courts, the idea of innocent until proven guilty was about as popular as bathing in December. If someone pointed a finger at you and said, "He's a thief," the court's response wasn't, "Let's investigate." It was more like, "Grab the rope." You didn't need motive, means, or opportunity. Just bad luck and maybe a neighbor who didn't like your chickens wandering into his garden. The burden of proof. That was your problem. You had to prove you didn't do it, which is a bit like trying to prove you didn't eat the last piece of bread 3 days ago. Good luck. Witnesses were unreliable. Evidence was mostly hearsay, and if you looked nervous in court, well, that was suspicious too. And if you looked too calm, definitely hiding something. The system was especially harsh on the poor, the foreign, and the unfortunate souls who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If you couldn't afford a bribe or didn't have a noble to vouch for you, your odds of walking free were about the same as a snowball's in a blacksmith's forge. So how did you clear your name? Simple. You confessed. Because in this world of suspicion and superstition, and confession was gold, and pain was the path to it. In the medieval justice system, a confession was the crown jewel. It didn't matter if it was true, half true, or completely made up between screams. If you confessed, the paperwork practically filled itself. Judges loved it. Clerics nodded solemnly, and the torturer, he got to clock out early. But getting that confession, that's where the real craftsmanship came in. You couldn't just ask nicely. No. You had to encourage the truth out of people, gently, with thumbscrews. Or maybe a little waterboarding, medieval style, of course, with buckets and cloth, and a complete disregard for respiratory health. The goal wasn't to kill. It was to make you wish you were dead, just long enough to say, yes, I did it. I stole the bishop's chicken. I also hexed the weather, and I may have danced naked under a full moon, but only once. And once you confessed. Oh, the relief. For everyone. The court got closure, the church got validation, and you got, well, probably more torture. But at least now it was official, because in this world, truth wasn't found. It was extracted, preferably with a crank, a rope, and a witness who could write fast. Which brings us to the professionals of pain and piety, the Inquisition, when faith became fear. Spanish Inquisition, but also French, papal medieval. Ah yes, the Inquisition. The church's version of customer service. Except instead of asking how they could help, they asked if you'd like to confess before or after the thumbscrews. Most people know about the Spanish Inquisition, thanks to history books and Monty Python. But fewer realize it was just one flavor in a whole buffet of ecclesiastical anxiety. The medieval Inquisition kicked things off in the 12th century, mostly in France and Italy. It was like the church suddenly realized, people are thinking for themselves. That won't do. So they sent out inquisitors, usually Dominican friars with a flair for dramatic robes and a deep suspicion of anyone who read too much. Their job: sniff out heresy like bloodhounds in sandals. Then came the Papal Inquisition, which sounds fancy because it was. Pope Gregory EX decided heresy needed a more centralized approach, like a franchise model. He appointed inquisitors who traveled from town to town, asking the locals, anyone here denying transubstantiation? If someone sneezed at the wrong moment, they were on the list. And of course, the French Inquisition had its own flair. They were particularly obsessed with the Cathars, a group who believed the material world was evil. The church disagreed, especially since it had just finished building some very expensive cathedrals. So they launched the Albigensian Crusade, which was less crusade and more medieval purge with a side of theological paperwork. But the Spanish Inquisition, that was the deluxe edition. Founded in 1478 by Ferdinand and Isabella, it came with royal backing, secret tribunals, and a deep mistrust of anyone who had ever lit a menorah or faced Mecca. It wasn't just about heresy. It was about control. And it came with all the bells and whistles, anonymous accusations, surprise arrests, and a torture chamber that doubled as a confessional booth. Because across all these inquisitions, French, Papal, Spanish, and medieval, the mission was clear: use torture to root out heresy, devil worship, and dissent. That's right. If you so much as sneezed during Mass, or looked a little too curious about astronomy, you might find yourself on the church's "let's have a chat" list. The Inquisition wasn't just about rooting out heresy. It was about rooting it out with flair. And by flair, I mean a full catalogue of pain, fear, and the occasional flaming stake. The church saw heresy not just as a theological disagreement, but as a contagious disease, and like any good medieval doctor, their solution was to bleed it out, or burn it out, or stretch it out. Whatever worked. Suspected heretics were rounded up, questioned, and if they didn't confess quickly enough, well, the inquisitors had ways of making them talk. Very creative ways. And it wasn't just about heresy. The Inquisition also had a keen interest in devil worship, sorcery, and anyone who dared to say, hey, maybe the earth goes around the sun. Galileo would like a word. But only after house arrest. The accused were often kept in secret prisons, denied legal counsel, and interrogated under the warm, loving glow of candlelight and red, hot pokers. And if you thought you could get away by saying, "I'm innocent," think again. That just meant you were really good at hiding your heresy. Better crank the rack another notch. But here's the kicker. This wasn't some rogue operation. This was official, sanctioned, documented. The church didn't just allow torture, they organized it. With rules, with guidelines, with a disturbingly detailed sense of timing and technique. Because eventually, the church codified pain. How long, how hard, how much blood. Yes, believe it or not, there was a time when theologians and inquisitors sat down and said, "Let's make this official." Torture wasn't just improvised in a dark cellar by some guy named Gregor with a rusty hook. It was regulated. The church, in its quest for order and orthodoxy, developed detailed guidelines for how to apply pain in the pursuit of truth. Because if you're going to extract confessions through agony, you might as well do it by the book. There were limits, on paper, at least. Torture had to be moderate. Which sounds comforting until you realize that moderate was defined by people who thought boiling oil was a reasonable conversation starter. The rules specified how many times a person could be tortured once, technically, but conveniently left room for continuations if the inquisitor felt the spirit move him. So you weren't tortured twice. You were just still being tortured. Totally different. They even debated the duration of screams. Too short, not convincing. Too long, might be faking. And blood, ideally not too much. Torture was supposed to be persuasive, not messy. A clean confession was a holy confession. So they developed techniques that inflicted maximum pain with minimal gore. Like the strappado, which dislocated shoulders without spilling a drop. Efficient and ecclesiastically approved. And of course, all of this had to be recorded. Every crank of the rack, every groan, every whispered, "I did it," was written down in neat Latin script by a scribe who probably needed therapy and a stiff drink. They documented everything, painfully, literally, every twist of the rack, every drop of sweat, every "I swear I didn't do it," was carefully recorded by a scribe who probably had the worst job in the monastery. Imagine being the guy who had to sit in the corner of a dungeon, quill in hand, while Brother Heinrich cranked someone's limbs like a medieval rotisserie. Noti subject screamed at volume level 6. Confessed to heresy and possibly stealing a goose. Further investigation pending. These weren't just casual notes, either. The church loved paperwork. Torture sessions came with full transcripts, names, dates, instruments used, confession details, and whether the accused fainted, vomited, or sang hymns under duress. It was like a grim version of Yelp reviews, but for pain. Strappado 3 stars. Effective, but dislocated both shoulders. Would not recommend for repeat use. And why all the documentation? Because even in the darkest corners of medieval justice, bureaucracy reigned supreme. If you were going to extract a confession through agony, you had to make sure it was legally agonizing. That meant writing it all down. In Latin, with proper margins. Heaven forbid someone got tortured off the record. That would be chaos. Plus, these records were useful. They helped inquisitors refine their techniques, compare notes, and make sure they weren't accidentally torturing the wrong guy. Again. And if anyone ever questioned the church's methods, they could just pull out a scroll and say, "See, it's all here." Signed, sealed, and blood-stained. But the best part, these records often included little notes about the rules. Because yes, there were rules. Torture wasn't a free for all. It was a regulated nightmare. Which brings us to the next chapter in this charming tale of medieval hospitality. The rules of torture, legal limits. Don't kill them right away. Yes, believe it or not, medieval torture came with a rule book, and somewhere near the top, in fancy Latin, was the golden guideline. Try not to kill them. Yet. Because dead people don't confess, and more importantly, they don't make very good examples. The whole point was to get the truth, or something that sounded like it, without accidentally turning the suspect into a corpse before the paperwork was done. So inquisitors had to walk a fine line. Enough pain to make you talk, but not so much that you stopped breathing. It was like cooking a very nervous software. Apply too much heat, and the whole thing collapses. That's why they had rules about how long you could be tortured, how many times, and even how many assistants could hold you down. Spoiler, it was usually more than one, and if you passed out, that was a problem. Torture had to be paused until you were conscious again, because unconscious confessions were frowned upon, mostly because they were hard to write down. So they'd revive you with water, slaps, or the medieval version of smelling salts, which may have just been a bucket of something awful, and then pick up right where they left off. Welcome back! Now, where were we? Ah, yes! The rack. The church even had a term for this delicate balance, moderate torture, which is a bit like saying gentle mauling, or light beheading. It meant you could stretch, crush, or burn, just not too much. Think of it as the Goldilocks zone of agony. Not too soft, not too fatal, just right. Because in the end, techniques had to stop just before death. That was the rule. Not out of mercy, mind you, but because dead people are notoriously bad at signing confessions. The church and the courts wanted results, not corpses. So inquisitors had to become masters of the almost broken, almost unconscious, almost dead. It was a delicate dance of agony and anatomy. They had to read the room, literally. If the accused started foaming at the mouth or speaking in tongues. Unless it was Latin, which was fine, the torturer had to ease off. Whoa there, Brother Thomas, he's turning blue. Let's give him a moment to catch his breath, and maybe his sanity, before we continue. After all, a dead heretic was just a missed opportunity for a really solid confession. So they developed a kind of sixth sense for suffering. They knew just how far to twist, how long to stretch, how many turns of the screw it took to get someone to say, "Yes, I did it. I danced with the devil, I cursed the crops, and I may have insulted the bishop's hat." But once that confession came out, the job wasn't done. Because here's the kicker, a confession under torture wasn't enough. Confession under pain had to be reconfirmed later. Yes, because nothing says trustworthy legal system. Like dragging someone through hours of agony, getting them to admit they're a heretic, a witch, and possibly the inventor of bad weather, and then turning around the next day and saying, "Okay, now say it again, but this time without the screaming." That's right. Medieval courts required that any confession extracted under torture had to be repeated voluntarily afterward. Voluntarily. As in, sure, I'd love to repeat everything I said, while dangling upside down with my joints rearranged like a medieval jigsaw puzzle. This second confession was supposed to prove that first one wasn't just the result of, being tortured. So the accused would be brought back into court, usually still limping, bandaged, and possibly missing a few teeth, and asked, "Do you still stand by your confession?" And most people, understandably, said yes. Because saying no might mean another round with the rack, and frankly, Once you've been stretched like a loaf of sourdough, you're not eager for a sequel. The whole process was like a grim legal dancey torture. Confession, rest, reconfirmation. It was bureaucracy meets brutality. And the best part, if the accused didn't reconfirm, the court could just say, sounds suspicious, and start the whole thing over again. Because clearly, if you recanted, you were lying. And if you confirmed, well, you were guilty. It was a win-win for the inquisitors. And of course, all of this was written down, carefully, in Latin, with ink made from oak galls and the tears of exhausted scribes. Because medieval justice wasn't just cruel. It was organized. It wasn't just torture. It was a brutal theater of technicalities. That's what medieval torture really was. A bureaucratic nightmare wrapped in a blood-stained robe. It wasn't just about pain. It was about properly administered pain. You couldn't just toss someone on the rack and call it a day. No. There were forms to fill out, procedures to follow, and a scribe in the corner, furiously scribbling every groan and whimper like he was taking minutes at the world's worst staff meeting. Everything had to be done by the book. And not just any book. The church's official torture manual, which, yes, was a real thing. It laid out exactly how much pain was acceptable, how long it could last, and how many times you could continue a session without technically breaking the rules. Spoiler, once could mean as many times as we feel like, as long as we take a snack break in between. It was a legal circus, complete with loopholes, Latin, and a whole lot of screaming. You could be tortured moderately, which in practice meant until you confessed, passed out, or both. And if you died, well, someone probably forgot to check the "don't kill" box on the form. Oops. But the real stars of this grim performance, the tools of pain. Let's start with the headliner, the rack stretch until they snap. This charming device looked like a medieval pilates machine from hell. A long wooden frame with rollers at each end. It was designed to turn the human body into a very unwilling piece of taffy. The victim was tied by the wrists and ankles, then slowly, so slowly, stretched as the rollers turned, not yanked, not snapped, stretched. Like someone was trying to iron out your skeleton. And the results? Muscles torn, joints popped, ligaments shredded. All while the torturer nodded thoughtfully, and the scribe dipped his quill again. Subject now 2 inches taller, possibly confessed to inventing sin. The rack was not subtle. It didn't whisper, it cracked. Victims were stretched inch by inch, their bodies pulled like medieval taffy, until their shoulders dislocated, their hips groaned, and their tendons waved little white flags of surrender. You didn't just confess on the rack, you sang, in multiple octaves. And if you were lucky, you stopped just before your spine decided to audition for a new shape. The beauty, if we can call it that, was in the slow, deliberate nature of it. This wasn't a quick snap. It was a long, creaking, bone-popping journey into the outer limits of human flexibility. Think yoga, but with more screaming and fewer scented candles. And the torturer. He wasn't rushing. He was pacing himself, like a chef slow roasting a confession. And sometimes, if the crank turned too far, or the victim was particularly enthusiastic in their resistance, things got messy. Skin tore, ligaments gave up, and in the worst cases, sometimes bones came out of skin. Yes, out. As in, hello, I'm your femur, and I'd like to see the sun now. The rack didn't just stretch people. It turned them into medieval spaghetti. Ligaments snapped like old violin strings. Shoulders popped out like corks. And in the worst cases, bones decided they were done being inside and made a dramatic exit. It wasn't just painful. It was visually informative. You didn't need a confession after that. You just needed a mop. And the torturer. He'd nod, maybe jot something down like, "Subject now resembles scarecrow, proceeding well." Meanwhile, the scribe in the corner was probably trying not to faint while sketching a diagram for the records. Noti. Left tibia now pointing east. But here's the thing. This wasn't just for fun. This wasn't medieval CrossFit. The rack had a purpose, a dark, twisted bone, snapping purpose. Used to get names, confessions, or just screams. The rack wasn't picky. It didn't care if you were guilty, innocent, or just really bad at keeping secrets. It was the medieval equivalent of, let's see what falls out when we shake the box. And fall out it did. Names of accomplices, confessions of crimes, and sometimes just a long, uninterrupted scream that sounded vaguely like, "I regret everything." The rack didn't need logic. It needed leverage, and it got it, one crank at a time. But not every tool was about stretching. Some were about splitting, quietly, intimately, horrifyingly. Enter the next contestant in this charming parade of medieval hospitality. The peer of anguish silence, through splitting. Inserted in the mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on the crime, the mood, or the sheer creativity of the torturer. Because nothing says justice like a metal fruit designed to bloom where no fruit should ever bloom. The peer of anguish silence, through splitting. Now this charming contraption really took the phrase, "Speak no evil," to a whole new level. The peer of anguish looked harmless enough at first glance. Kind of like a metallic artichoke, crossed with a medieval nutcracker. But don't let the name fool you. There was nothing fruity about what came next. It was inserted into, shall we say, highly personal locations, depending on your alleged crime, spoke blasphemy, in the mouth, committed sodomy, into the back alley, accused of witchcraft or adultery, into the royal chamber. Once in place, a screw mechanism slowly opened the petals, expanding the pier outward until it did more damage than a week's worth of justing accidents. The purpose? Pain, silencing, and perhaps the world's worst anatomy lesson. It didn't kill, at least not right away. But it certainly discouraged speaking, sitting, or blinking normally ever again. And if you thought you'd scream for help, good luck. With that thing in your mouth, the best you could manage was a vague gargling noise, and a look of sheer existential regret. Medieval interrogators loved it, because it left very few marks on the outside, which made it great for plausible deniability. What? Injuries? I see no bruises. He must have slipped, internally. And, of course, the scribes wrote it all down in neat little Latin notes like, applied peer to mouth, subject now non-verbal, confession, imminent. Turn to expand and tear from within. The peer of anguish wasn't just a tool, it was a statement, a very sharp, very invasive statement. Once inserted into the chosen orifice, be it the mouth for blasphemers, the back door for those accused of certain unholy acts, or the more intimate route for women accused of witchcraft, the torturer would begin to turn a screw at the top, slowly, deliberately, like winding up a music box from the underworld. As the screw turned, the metal petals of the pear began to open outward, not with a snap, but with a slow, blooming menace. It didn't slice. It didn't stab. It expanded. From the inside, stretching tissue, nerves, and dignity well beyond their comfort zones. The goal wasn't to kill, at least not immediately. It was to silence, to shame, to make the accused feel as if their own body had turned against them. And the worst part, it left very little evidence on the outside, which made it perfect for inquisitors who wanted results without the mess. No bruises, Your Grace. Just a very quiet heretic. This charming device was reportedly used on blasphemers, women accused of witchcraft, and those charged with sodomy, because nothing says moral correction like a medieval fruit blooming in the worst possible place. Peer of Anguish was the medieval multi-tool of moral panic. It didn't discriminate. If you said the wrong thing, worshipped the wrong way, or loved the wrong person, you might find yourself face to face or otherwise with this blooming nightmare. Its versatility was part of its horror. Mouth, backdoor, or front. Each application was tailored to the crime, like a twisted version of medieval customer service. You insulted the church, open wide. Practiced forbidden love, we've got just the spot. Accused of witchcraft, well, brace yourself. And once inserted, the torturer would begin to turn the screw. Slowly, deliberately. The metal petals would expand outward, pressing against soft tissue, nerves and every ounce of dignity the victim had left. It didn't slice, it spread. It didn't kill, at least not immediately. But it left behind trauma that no amount of Gregorian chanting could heal. It was rarely used alone. Often, it was just the opening act in a longer, bloodier performance. But even as a solo instrument, it earned a reputation that echoed through dungeons and whispered through terrified townsfolk. Because among the many tools in the Inquisitor's cabinet, it was one of the most feared and least survived. The Peer of Anguish wasn't just a torture device. It was a medieval mic drop. Its reputation alone could silence a room faster than a bishop walking into a tavern. Whispers of it travelled from dungeons to marketplaces, carried by terrified townsfolk and very nervous scribes. It was the kind of tool that didn't need to be used often. Just knowing it existed was enough to keep most people in line. And those who did experience it, let's just say they weren't exactly writing memoirs afterward. Its effectiveness wasn't just in the pain. It was in the precision. It was targeted, personal. A message sent directly to the body's most sensitive inbox. And unlike the rack or the iron boot, it didn't need a whole stage crew to operate. Just one torturer, a screw, and a complete disregard for human anatomy. But not every tool in the Inquisitor's kit was a grand production. Some were small, subtle, almost polite. Enter the next act in this grim little cabaret. The thumbscrew, small pain, big power. A simple vice for fingers, toes, or thumbs. Because sometimes, all it takes to break a person is a little pressure in the right place. The thumbscrew was the minimalist's torture device. No flames, no pulleys, no dramatic screaming, echoing through stone corridors. Well, not at first. Just a small metal clamp, a screw, and a whole lot of bad intentions. It looked almost innocent, like something you'd find in a carpenter's toolbox. But instead of holding wood in place, it held you by your digits. The process was delightfully straightforward in the most horrifying way. The victim's thumb, toe, or sometimes all 5 fingers were placed between 2 iron plates. Then, slowly, so slowly, the screw was turned. Each twist brought the plates closer together, crushing flesh, splintering bone, and turning knuckles into medieval trail mix. Some versions even had spikes on the inside, just in case the crushing alone wasn't persuasive enough too. And the best part, it was portable. You didn't need a dungeon or a team of assistants. Just a torturer with strong wrists and a questionable sense of ethics. It was the Swiss Army knife of pain. Compact, efficient, and always ready to ruin someone's day. It didn't kill. It didn't maim as permanently, if you were lucky, but it hurt. Deeply. Personally. And it sent a very clear message. We're just getting started. quiet, controlled, and extremely effective. The thumbscrew was the introvert of the torture world. Didn't make a scene. Didn't need a dungeon full of iron spikes or dramatic lighting. Just a small vice, a few fingers, and a torturer with a steady hand and a questionable sense of empathy. It was the kind of device that whispered, "Let's start small and see where the day takes us." It didn't roar like the rack or bloom like the pier. It clicked, one turn at a time, a slow, deliberate squeeze that turned knuckles into kindling and fingernails into distant memories. Victims often tried to hold out, thinking, "It's just my thumb. How bad can it be?" And then, click, they discovered a whole new vocabulary of regret. The beauty of the thumbscrew was its subtlety. It didn't need to break you all at once. It just needed to suggest what might come next. A little pressure, a little crunch, a little, "Would you like to name names now, or shall we move on to your toes?" Because the thumbscrew wasn't the main event. It was the trailer, the teaser, the ominous music before the monster appears. Often used before bigger tortures. Preview. The thumbscrew was the medieval equivalent of a movie trailer short, intense, and guaranteed to make you dread the feature presentation. It was the appetizer of agony, the amuse-bouche of brutality. Inquisitors loved it because it was quick, tidy, and didn't require a full production crew. Just a victim, a vice, and a torturer with a flair for subtlety. It was often the first stop on the grand tour of pain. A little squeeze here, a little crunch there, just enough to loosen the tongue and rattle the nerves. If the accused started talking, great. If not, well, there were bigger toys waiting in the wings. The rack, the iron boot, the Judas cradle, they were all standing by, polishing their chains and humming ominously. But the thumbscrew had its own charm. It was intimate, personal. You didn't need a dungeon the size of a cathedral, just a quiet corner, a sturdy table, and maybe a candle for ambience. It was the kind of device you could carry in your robe, pocket, like a very unfortunate fidget spinner, which is why it earned its place in the Inquisitor's toolkit as the go-to-warm-up act. Easily portable, even used in dungeons beneath courts. That's right, the thumbscrew was the medieval torturer's equivalent of a pocket knife. Compact, efficient, and always ready to ruin someone's afternoon. You didn't need a sprawling torture chamber or a dramatic thunderstorm outside. Just a quiet room beneath the courthouse, a sturdy table, and a suspect who looked a little too confident. Inquisitors loved it because it was discreet. You could carry it in your robe like a grim little paperweight. Oh, this? Just my devotional clamp. For prayerful reflection. And before the accused knew it, their fingers were being slowly flattened like medieval pancakes. It was the kind of device that whispered, "We're not mad, just disappointed," and also about to crush your thumbs. It was especially popular in legal settings. Those charming stone, walled basements beneath courts, where justice was served with a side of bone splinters. No need for gallows or grandstanding. Just a few turns of the screw, and a very persuasive, "Shall we continue?" But not all torture devices were so subtle. Some were theatrical, iconic, the stuff of nightmares and heavy metal album covers. Which brings us to the most infamous and possibly imaginary diva of the dungeon, the Iron Maiden, real or myth. An iron cabinet lined with inward spikes, and a reputation sharp enough to draw blood on its own. Iron cabinet lined with inward spikes. Ah yes, the Iron Maiden. Not the band, though they've caused their fair share of auditory suffering, but the infamous torture device that looks like a goth wardrobe with commitment issues. Picture this: a human-sized iron sarcophagus, hinged like a closet, with the inside lined with spikes. Not long sword-like spikes. Oh no, that would be too merciful. These were short, cruel little things, just long enough to pierce the skin, puncture a lung, maybe nick a kidney, but not quite enough to kill you outright. Because why go for instant death when you can offer a slow, agonizing bleed out with a side of claustrophobia? The idea was simple. Shove the accused inside, close the doors, and let the spikes do their delicate, organ-dodging dance. The spikes were supposedly arranged with surgical precision. One for the eye, a couple for the ribs, one for the bladder. Because why not? And a few for the more sensitive areas. The goal wasn't to kill immediately. It was to encourage reflection. Painful, blood-soaked reflection. But here's the twist: this whole spiky nightmare, probably never used. In fact, it's likely the Iron Maiden is one of history's most dramatic cases of retroactive horror fan fiction. While it's been paraded through museums and horror films as the pinnacle of medieval cruelty, most historians now believe it was a 19th century invention, cobbled together from bits of older punishment devices and a healthy dose of imagination too. The first real mention of an Iron Maiden-like device doesn't show up until the late 1700s, and even then, it reads more like a gothic horror story than a court record. Some believe it was inspired by the Schandmantel or coat of shame, a German punishment barrel used for public humiliation, not impalement. But someone, somewhere, looked at that and thought, you know what this needs? Spikes. Lots of spikes. And thus, the Iron Maiden was born. Not in a medieval dungeon, but likely in a museum curator's imagination, sometime around the Enlightenment, when people were obsessed with how barbaric the Middle Ages had been. It was the historical equivalent of a haunted house prop. Terrifying, theatrical, and just plausible enough to make you wonder. So while it may not have skewered any sinners in the 13th century, it did pierce the collective imagination of the 18th and 19th centuries. Probably 18th century meth built on medieval fear. Despite its spiked celebrity status, the Iron Maiden likely never saw action in a medieval dungeon. In fact, most historians agree it was a product of Enlightenment-era imagination, an 18th or even 19th century invention designed to showcase just how barbaric the Middle Ages supposedly were. Think of it as historical cosplay, with a flair for the dramatic. The earliest known Iron Maiden was assembled in the late 1700s in Nuremberg, Germany, right around the time people were getting really into cataloguing the horrors of the past, and also inventing a few for flair. It was a time when museums were popping up, and nothing drew a crowd like a good old-fashioned torture exhibit. So someone, somewhere, looked at a few rusty parts, added some spikes, and said, "Voil! Behold the cruelty of our ancestors!" It was theatrical. It was terrifying. It was probably never used. There are no reliable medieval records of anyone being locked inside a spiked coffin while monks took notes. No court transcripts. No scribes jotting down. Subject now resembles pincushion. Confession. Pending. Just a lot of 18th century showmanship, and a public eager to believe the worst about the so-called Dark Ages. But here's the thing, even if it was a fabrication, it worked. The Iron Maiden became a symbol of medieval horror, a towering iron metaphor for cruelty, silence, and the cold efficiency of pain. It appeared in books, films, haunted houses, and in heavy metal lyrics. It didn't need a real past, it had a powerful presence. Because sometimes, the myth is more enduring than the truth. But the idea of it was terrifying enough to endure. Even if the Iron Maiden never actually skewered a single soul in a medieval dungeon, its reputation did all the heavy lifting. The mere thought of being locked inside a human-sized metal coffin lined with spikes was enough to make even the boldest heretic reconsider their life choices. It was psychological warfare in iron form. A device that didn't need to exist in practice because it had already taken up permanent residence in the collective imagination. Artists painted it. Writers described it. Tour guides whispered about it in candlelit castle tours. It became the poster child for medieval cruelty, the spiked prom queen of torture lore. And like all good legends, it grew with every retelling. The spikes got sharper, the victims more numerous, the screams more echoey. It didn't matter that historians were side-eyeing the whole thing by the 19th century. By then, the Iron Maiden had already gone viral, sex in a parchment and quill kind of way. It was the perfect storm of horror and theatre. A device so diabolical, so perfectly medieval, that it had to be true, right? Well, no. But that didn't stop it from becoming a star. Museum piece turned legend. The Iron Maiden may never have pierced a single soul in medieval times, but it pierced the imagination of generations to come. Once it entered the museum circuit, usually with a dramatic spotlight and a plaque that read something like "Authentic medieval horror," probably. It became a superstar. People lined up to gawk at it, whisper about it, and take blurry photos next to it, while nervously checking for hidden spikes. It was the perfect blend of myth and metal, a relic that didn't need a verified kill count to be terrifying. Its very shape, tall, looming, with a face that looked like it had opinions about your sins, was enough to send shivers down the spine. And museums knew exactly what they had: a conversation starter, a spine tingler, a spiked celebrity. Whether it stood in a dusty corner of a castle or center stage in a traveling exhibition, the Iron Maiden didn't need to do anything anymore. It had already won the PR war, and so it endured. Not because it was real, but because it felt real. Because it fit so perfectly into the narrative of medieval cruelty that people wanted to believe it. It was the horror movie prop that history accidentally took seriously. But while the Iron Maiden may have been more legend than reality, the places that inspired such nightmares, torture chambers and execution squares, dark stone rooms below castles and churches, where the screams were very real and the walls remembered everything. Dark stone rooms below castles and churches. Ah yes, the medieval basement, where the DA core was damp despair, and the lighting was provided by a single flickering torch and the occasional flash of existential dread. These weren't your average cellars for storing wine and potatoes. No, these were the VIP lounges of pain, tucked beneath cathedrals and keeps, where the air was thick with incense, mildew, and the faint aroma of regret. These subterranean chambers were carved from stone so cold it could chill your soul and your toes. The walls were often slick with condensation, which was either from the humidity or the collective sweat of centuries of terrified prisoners. The ceilings were low, the acoustics were excellent for echoing screams, and the ambience was somewhere between monastic austerity and dungeon chic. And the furniture. Oh, the furniture. Forget plush chairs or cozy benches. These rooms were furnished with chains, manacles, and benches that doubled as orthopedic nightmares. There were hooks in the walls, rings in the floor, and the occasional drain in the corner, ostensibly for cleaning. But let's not ask too many questions. But the real stars of the show were the implements. These weren't just tools, they were statements. Each one lovingly crafted by someone who clearly thought. What if a blacksmith and a sadist opened a boutique together? They were arranged on the walls with the care of a surgeon's tray or a particularly macabre charcuterie board. Iron pincers branding irons, bone crushers, and tongue tearers, each one gleaming ill or rusting under the torchlight, waiting for its moment in the spotlight. Some were hung neatly on pegs, others laid out on velvet, lined tables like cursed cutlery, and they all had names. Not official ones, mind you, but nicknames whispered by torturers with a flair for the dramatic. Ah, this one. We call her the Widowmaker. She's shy at first, but she opens up. It was a strange blend of horror and hospitality. Like a medieval spa, if your spa treatment involved screaming and your masseuse wore a hood. Implements displayed like surgical tools. In the dim torchlight of medieval torture chambers, the tools of torment weren't tossed into a dusty corner, like old firewood. Oh no. These instruments were presented, displayed, curated with the care of a royal jeweler, showing off the crown's finest gems. Only instead of diamonds and rubies, you had iron claws, bone saws, and tongue tearers, each one gleaming or rusting with purpose. They were arranged on walls like a blacksmith's greatest hits album. Hooks, pincers, branding irons, and screws, all lined up in neat rows, each with its own horrifying specialty. Some were polished to a shine, others still bore the stains of their last performance. And if you were lucky, there was a torturer nearby who'd give you the grand tour. This one's for heretics, this one's for liars, and this one. This one's just for fun. It was less a dungeon, and more a twisted operating theatre. The torturer was the surgeon. The tools were his scalpels, and the patient. Well, let's just say anesthesia wasn't on the menu. The whole setup had the eerie precision of a medical exam. If your doctor wore a hood and asked you to scream into the pillow. And the scribes. They were the interns, dutifully recording every crack, pop, and confession like it was a clinical trial. Subject responded poorly to the iron boot. Recommend thumbscrew for next session. But the real spectacle wasn't always in the dungeon. Sometimes, the pain was taken outside, to the cobbled squares and open fields, where justice was served with a side of public theatre. Public punishments drawn crowds, cheering and weeping. The medieval town square, where justice met pageantry and trauma, was a group activity. Public punishments weren't just about enforcing the law, they were events. People brought their children. Merchants set up snack stalls. Someone probably sold commemorative woodcuts. It was the original reality TV, except with more mud and fewer commercial breaks. The condemned would be marched in, often to the sound of drums or jeering crowds, and placed in the stocks, the pillory, or, if they'd really made a mess of things, on the gallows. The punishment might be a whipping, a branding, or something more final. And the audience, oh, they were invested. Some came to cheer, others came to cry. A few came just to throw vegetables with suspicious accuracy. These spectacles served multiple purposes: deterrence, entertainment, and a good old-fashioned reminder of who was in charge. They reinforced the social order with every lash and every gasp. The message was clear: step out of line, and you too could be the afternoon's entertainment. But behind the drama, behind the spectacle, stood a figure both central and shadowed. The one who made it all happen, who turned sentences into screams and silence. Executioners, seen as both feared and needed. They were the grim punctuation marks at the end of a royal decree. The executioner didn't just swing the axe or tie the noose. He was the law's final word, the state's sharp edge. And yet, for all their importance, executioners lived in a strange social limbo, essential, but untouchable. Like the medieval version of IT support, everyone needed them. No one wanted to sit next to them at dinner. Their job was brutal, yes, but it required skill. A clean beheading wasn't just about brute strength. It was about precision, timing, and a steady hand. One wrong swing, and suddenly the crowd was watching a very messy, very public anatomy lesson. The best executioners were prized for their efficiency. The worst, well, they got talked about for all the wrong reasons. Despite their usefulness, executioners were often shunned. They lived on the outskirts of town, both literally and socially. People crossed the street to avoid them. They couldn't marry into respectable families. And yet, when the bell tolled and justice needed a face, everyone turned to the man with the hood and the axe. They were feared, yes, but also respected. Because in a world where justice was loud, bloody, and very public, someone had to do the dirty work. And that someone had to be good at it. But not all victims of medieval justice were thieves or traitors. Some were simply women. Widows. Healers, midwives, or just a little too outspoken for comfort. Women and torture witches, widows, and whispers. Women targeted during witch trials. If you were a woman in early modern Europe and had the audacity to be poor, unmarried, outspoken, or simply own a cat, congratulations! You were already halfway to being labeled a witch. The witch trials weren't just about rooting out dark magic. They were about rooting out inconvenient women. The ones who didn't fit the mold. The ones who spoke too much, knew too much, or simply existed in a way that made others uncomfortable. Midwives, widows, herbalists, and women who dared to live alone were especially vulnerable. Why? Because they had knowledge, influence, independence. And in a society where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and preferably invisible, that was downright suspicious. If you helped deliver babies, you were meddling with life. If you brewed herbal teas, you were clearly concocting potions. If you had a miscarriage, well, what exactly were you doing with that womb of yours? The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, a 15th century witch, hunting manual written by two men who clearly needed a hobby, declared that women were more susceptible to witchcraft because they were weaker in faith and more carnal. Translation: we don't understand women, so let's burn them. And so, the accusations flew. Sometimes sparked by a neighbor's grudge, a failed harvest, or a cow that looked at someone funny. Trials were held. Torture was applied. Confessions were extracted. Because nothing says justice like asking someone if they're a witch while stretching them on a rack, and the reasons for suspicion. Oh, they were creative. Tortured for miscarriages, talking to cats, or knowing herbs. In the grand tradition of medieval logic, if a woman had a miscarriage, it wasn't biology. It was sorcery. If she talked to her cat, it wasn't companionship, it was conspiracy. And if she knew which herbs could ease a fever or soothe a cough, clearly, she was in league with the devil, and probably had a broomstick parked out back. The witch trials weren't just about rooting out evil. They were about rooting out inconvenience. Women who didn't conform, who knew too much, or who simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place with the wrong uterus were prime targets. A miscarriage, which today we understand as a tragic and often unpreventable event, was then seen as suspicious. Why did the baby not survive? Must be witchcraft. Or maybe she danced too close to the moon. And cats. Oh, cats were very suspicious, especially black ones. If a woman fed a stray or, heaven forbid, named it, she was practically signing a pact with Satan. The cat was her familiar, a demonic assistant who helped her cast spells, ruin crops, and probably overcook the neighbor's stew. As for herbs, well, let's just say that knowing the difference between rosemary and hemlock could get you a 1. one-way ticket to the nearest dungeon. Midwives and herbalists, who had centuries of practical knowledge passed down through generations, were suddenly seen as dangerous. Because nothing says threat to society like a woman who can cure a headache without praying for 6 hours. And once accused, the path to proving innocence was, let's say, counterintuitive. The swimming ordeal: if you float, you're guilty. Because obviously water, being pure, would reject evil. So if you floated, you were a witch. If you sank, congratulations! You were innocent, and also drowning. The medieval justice system's version of sink or swim. Except in this case, both options were terrible. Welcome to the swimming ordeal, where logic took a holiday and superstition ran the courtroom. Here's how it worked: the accused, usually a woman, often a widow, midwife, or someone who once made eye contact with a goat, was tied up, wrists to ankles, and gently yeeted into the nearest pond or river. But don't worry, they were attached to a rope. You know, for retrieval. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a test of buoyancy and theology. The theory went like this: water, being pure and holy, would reject a witch. So if the accused floated, it meant the water had said, "Nope, not today, Satan," and bounced her back up like a cursed pool noodle. Floating guilty. On the other hand, if she sank, the water had accepted her, and she was innocent. Hooray! Except she was also drowning. So, mixed results. And let's not forget the crowd. Oh, there was always a crowd. Townsfolk gathered like it was a festival. Kids with sticky hands, vendors selling roasted chestnuts, someone probably playing a lute in the background. Come one, come all. Watch justice flail. Now, you might be wondering, did anyone ever pass this test? Technically, yes. If you sank like a stone, you were declared innocent. But you also needed someone on the rope who was paying attention and not, say, distracted by a particularly aggressive duck. Otherwise, your acquittal came with a side of waterlogged lungs. And the floaters, straight to trial, or execution, or both, because nothing says fair legal system like punishing someone for being too buoyant. It's like being arrested for having good posture. The ordeal was so absurd that even some contemporaries raised eyebrows. Are we sure this is how God wants us to test for evil? Asked a few brave theologians. Shh, said the witch hunters. She just blinked weird. But here's the real kicker after the dunking. After the bruises and the humiliation and the near drowning, many of the accused were dragged back to the dungeon and asked, so, ready to confess. And honestly, many confessed just to end the agony. And who could blame them? After being dunked like a heretical teabag, stretched like medieval taffy, or introduced to the thumbscrew's charming embrace, most people weren't exactly in the mood to hold out for due process. The confessions that followed weren't always truthful, but they were understandably enthusiastic. Yes, I danced with the devil. Yes, I turned milk sore. Yes, I made eye contact with a goat, and now it won't stop following me. Can I go now? The inquisitors, of course, took these confessions as gospel. Never mind that they were extracted between bouts of waterboarding and impromptu chiropractic adjustments. The important thing was that the accused had admitted it. And once that box was ticked, the machinery of punishment could roll forward with righteous efficiency. Some confessed just to stop the pain. Others confessed to protect their families. A few confessed because they were delirious from sleep deprivation and thought the torturer was a talking turnip. But no matter the reason, the result was the same: assigned confession, a smug inquisitor, and a very bad day for the accused. And if you thought the ordeal ended there, Oh no! That was just the warm-up act. Because once you were labelled a heretic, the real show began. Torture of the accused heretic, where faith met force, and the rack had a starring role. Descriptions from real inquisitorial records. If you ever wondered what bureaucracy looks like when it's wearing a hood and holding a branding iron, look no further than the inquisitorial records. These weren't just dusty scrolls tucked away in some forgotten monastery. They were meticulously kept documents, often written in elegant Latin, that chronicled every cough, confession, and crack of the whip with unnerving precision. The scribes of the Inquisition were not casual note-takers. They were the medieval equivalent of courtroom stenographers with a flair for drama. Every session was recorded, the questions asked, the answers given, yells or screamed, the instruments used, the reactions observed. If someone fainted, it was noted. If someone recanted, it was underlined. If someone tried to be clever, I only borrowed the heretical book. That too was immortalized in ink. Some records read like grim stage plays. You'd have the inquisitor's opening remarks, the accused's trembling responses, and the torturer's interjections, usually in the form of "subject remains silent," proceeding with the rack. Others were more clinical, listing charges, procedures, and outcomes with the emotional detachment of a tax audit. Applied strappado. Subject confessed to consorting with demons. Sentence: public penance and confiscation of goats. And the detail! These weren't vague summaries. They included names, dates, what was said, and what was done, down to the number of turns on the rack, or the exact phrasing of a confession. It was part legal record, part psychological profile, and part horror novella, all bound together in parchment and fear, ready to dive into the next layer of this grim bureaucracy. Let's open the ledger on names, dates, what was said, what was done. Inquisitorial records weren't just grim. They were meticulous. These weren't hastily scribbled notes on the back of a parchment napkin. No, these were full, blown bureaucratic masterpieces, complete with headings, margins, and the kind of obsessive detail that would make a modern tax auditor weep with joy. Each entry began with the essentials: the name of the accused, their age, occupation, and hometown. John, widow of a cooper, age 47. Suspected of heresy and suspiciously good at growing rosemary. Then came the date, always precise, because nothing says organized persecution like a well-kept calendar. And then the real meat of the record: what was said and what was done. Every question asked by the inquisitor was recorded. Every answer, whether whispered, screamed, or sobbed, was transcribed. If the accused hesitated, it was noted. If they fainted, it was underlined. If they confessed, the exact wording was preserved like a grim little poem. The torturer's actions were also logged with chilling precision. Applied strappado at third hour. Subject cried out for mercy. Increased weight. Subject confessed to consorting with demons and over salting neighbor's stew. It was part legal document, part psychological profile, and part horror novella. And sometimes, amid the cold ink and rigid structure, a line would leap off the page. A moment of raw humanity that pierced through the parchment. Like the entry that simply read, "Subject cried out to God while being crushed." The heretic who, in the midst of agony, didn't curse or confess, but prayed. Not to the inquisitor, not to the crowd, but to the very God they were accused of betraying. And that cry, recorded in ink, buried in archives, echoes louder than any confession. Among the many names inked into inquisitorial ledgers, one stands out, not for what he confessed, but for what he refused to. His name was barely legible, scrawled in a trembling hand by a scribe who probably wished he were anywhere else. The charge. Heresy. The punishment. The press. An elegant euphemism for being slowly flattened under a growing pile of stones, like a very unfortunate medieval lasagna. He was offered the usual options: confess and be spared the worst, or resist and become a cautionary tale. He chose silence. So they laid him down, placed a board across his chest, and began to add weight. 1 stone. Then another. Then another. With each addition, his ribs creaked like old floorboards. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. The Inquisitor leaned in, quill poised, waiting for the inevitable surrender. But instead of a confession, the man whispered a prayer. Not to the Inquisitor. Not to the crowd. But to God. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It wasn't a bargain. It was a cry of faith, raw, defiant, and utterly inconvenient for the narrative. Because here was a man, accused of betraying the church, calling out to the very deity he was said to have abandoned. And the scribes, bless their conflicted hearts, wrote it down. Because even in a system built on fear and obedience, some truths were too loud to ignore. He didn't survive, but his final words did, echoing through parchment, through time, through the uneasy silence that follows every act of cruelty. Because not everyone broke the same way. Some resisted, some broke, some went mad. The torture chambers of the Inquisition weren't just places of physical torment. They were psychological crucibles. And not everyone emerged the same. Some resisted with a kind of terrifying clarity. They clenched their jaws, stared down their accusers, and refused to speak a word, even as the rack creaked, or the iron boots tightened. These were the ones who became legends, whispered about in taverns, and scribbled into the margins of forbidden books. Their silence was louder than any confession. Others broke. Not because they were weak, but because they were human. Because pain has a way of peeling back the layers of resolve, until all that's left is the desperate need for it to stop. They confessed to anything. Witchcraft, heresy, consorting with demons, stealing the bishop's cheese, just to make it end. And who could blame them? And then there were those who went mad. Who laughed when they should have screamed? Who whispered to shadows and sang hymns backward? The mind, after all, has its limits. And when stretched too far, by fear, by pain, by isolation, it snaps. The Inquisitors didn't always know what to do with these ones. Sometimes they were executed anyway. Sometimes they were left to rot. Sometimes they were paraded as proof of divine punishment. But as the centuries turned, and the blood dried on the dungeon stones, a new kind of whisper began to rise. Not from the tortured, but from the thinkers. A whisper that asked, is this justice? Renaissance doubt humanism awakens. Thinkers begin questioning cruelty. By the late Renaissance, as powdered wigs got taller and torture racks got squeakier, a curious thing began to happen. People started thinking, not just about how to build better cathedrals or paint more cherubs, but about whether maybe, just maybe, crushing someone's thumbs for stealing a loaf of bread was a bit excessive. Enter the humanists. These were scholars who dusted off ancient Greek and Roman texts and said, wait a minute. Socrates didn't waterboard anyone, and he seemed pretty wise. They began to wonder if perhaps truth, justice, and the occasional philosophical debate could be achieved without iron boots and red, hot pincers. Writers like Erasmus and Montaigne started poking holes in the idea that pain was a reliable path to truth. Sure, they mused, a man might confess under torture, but he'd also confess to being a turnip if it meant you'd stop stretching his limbs like medieval spaghetti. Even some inquisitors began to squint at their own methods and think, Maybe screaming isn't the sound of honesty. And then came the Enlightenment, when philosophers really leaned into the idea that reason might be a better tool than, say, a spiked chair. Thinkers like Voltaire, Beccaria, and Locke began to argue that cruelty wasn't just ineffective, it was barbaric, irrational, and frankly, a bit gauche. Beccaria, in particular, wrote a whole treatise saying torture was unreliable, unjust, and made the state look like a sadistic toddler with a magnifying glass. The shift was slow, of course. Some folks still clung to their racks and branding irons like comfort blankets. But the intellectual tide was turning. The idea that pain could produce truth was being challenged, not just morally, but logically, which led to the next great philosophical question, scribbled in candlelight and echoed in salons across Europe. Philosophers. Does pain reveal truth? Or is it just the world's worst lie detector with a flair for drama? The age-old question. Does pain unlock the secrets of the soul? Or just make you say whatever it takes to make it stop? Philosophers from the Renaissance onward began poking at this idea like a suspicious pudding. Thinkers like Montaigne, Beccaria, and later Enlightenment minds started asking, wait, if someone's being stretched like a medieval yoga pose and then says they're a witch, is that really a reliable confession? Or just a very creative way to say, please stop? Beccaria, in particular, was not having it. In his 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments, he basically said, torture is dumb. It punishes the weak, rewards the strong, and tells us nothing except who has the higher pain threshold. Which, let's be honest, is not the best foundation for a legal system. Imagine a courtroom where the verdict depends on whether you can outlast a hot poker. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defendant did not scream, clearly innocent. Even Voltaire, who had a flair for sarcasm and powdered wigs, chimed in with his usual bitey. Torture is the method of convincing a man that he is guilty, whether he is or not. Translation: if you twist someone's limbs long enough, they'll admit to sinking Atlantis. And so the philosophical tide began to turn. Pain, it seemed, was not the divine lie detector it had once been cracked up to be. It was messy. It was cruel. And worst of all, it was unreliable. Like trying to get a straight answer from a toddler covered in cookie crumbs. Which brings us to the next chapter in this slow, creaky evolution of justice. Torture becomes less reliable in legal systems. Because eventually, even the most dramatic rack enthusiast had to admit, truth shouldn't require a tourniquet. By the 18th century, the legal world began to experience a bit of an identity crisis. Judges, once proud wielders of the thumbscrew and the rack, started to look around and think, wait, are we the baddies? The Enlightenment had arrived, powdered wigs and all, and with it came a growing suspicion that maybe, just maybe, truth extracted under extreme duress wasn't the most reliable kind. Legal scholars and reformers began to question the logic of a system that relied on pain to produce honesty. After all, if someone will admit to being a werewolf just to get off the strappado, how trustworthy is that testimony? Courts started to realize that torture didn't just produce false confessions. It also made a mockery of justice. It was like trying to solve a puzzle by setting it on fire and hoping the ashes spell out the answer. In places like France, Italy, and the German states, legal reforms began to take root. Torture was gradually restricted, then banned outright in many jurisdictions. Judges were encouraged to rely on evidence, witness testimony, and, brace yourself, reason. The idea that a confession should be voluntary, not pried out with hot tongs, started to gain traction. It was a radical concept at the time, like suggesting that maybe doctors should wash their hands. And as the legal system evolved, so too did the culture around it. The public, once thrilled by the spectacle of public punishments, began to grow uneasy. The same Enlightenment thinkers who gave us democracy, scientific method, and the novel also gave us a new moral lens. One that didn't pair well with iron maidens and judicial beatings. Because as science advanced and humanism spread, a new tension emerged: scientific thinking and evolving morality clash with old ways. And suddenly, the rack was looking a little outdated. By the 17th century, Europe was having a bit of an identity crisis. On one hand, you had Enlightenment thinkers sipping coffee and writing essays about liberty, reason, and the rights of man. On the other, you had inquisitors still enthusiastically applying red-hot pokers to people's nether regions. It was like watching someone try to install a telescope in a dungeon. Progress and pain, awkwardly coexisting. Science was booming. Telescopes were peering into the heavens. Microscopes were peeking into pond water, and philosophers were poking holes in centuries of tradition. Maybe, they mused, we don't need to flay someone to find the truth. Maybe we could just ask them. Radical stuff. Meanwhile, morality was evolving too. Humanism was on the rise, and people were starting to think that perhaps justice shouldn't involve quite so much screaming. The idea that humans had inherent dignity, yes, even the ones who talked to cats or stole bread, was gaining traction. Suddenly, the old ways looked a bit medieval, literally. But the clash was real. Traditionalists clung to their racks and branding irons like family heirlooms. It's not torture, they insisted. It's enhanced interrogation with artisanal ironwork. Reformers, meanwhile, were busy writing treatises, founding academies, and inventing things like due process. The tension between old and new played out in courtrooms, universities, and the occasional very awkward town square execution. But slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. Torture began to fall out of legal favor, not because it stopped being painful, but because it stopped being useful. And also because philosophers wouldn't shut up about it. Which brings us to the final, flickering embers of the old regime, the last torturers, 17th-18th century, last legal tortures in Europe, where the gavel and the thumbscrew shared one last awkward handshake before parting ways forever. By the 1600s, torture was starting to look a little passé. The Enlightenment was in full swing, powdered wigs were getting taller, and philosophers were writing strongly worded essays about how maybe, just maybe, justice shouldn't involve iron spikes and involuntary stretching. Countries began phasing out torture from their legal systems like a bad fashion trend. Oh, we don't do the rack anymore, said Sweden in 1722, sipping tea and judging everyone. Prussia followed in 1754, Denmark in 1770, Austria in 1776, and the Netherlands in 1798. Even Russia, never one to rush into things, called it quits in 1801. But of course, not everyone was ready to let go of their favorite interrogation accessories. Some places clung to their torture traditions, like a medieval grandma refusing to upgrade her chamber DA core. What do you mean outdated? This Iron Maiden has been in the family for generations. And so, while the rest of Europe was embracing reason and reform, a few holdouts were still giving the thumbscrew one last nostalgic twist. France, Germany, and even England hold on a little too long, because nothing says, we're modern now, like dragging your feet while holding a branding iron. While much of Europe was busy embracing Enlightenment ideals, sipping espresso, and inventing democracy, or at least arguing about it loudly in salons, A few countries were still clutching their torture devices like heirlooms from Grandma's attic. France, Germany, and England, oh dear, just couldn't quite let go of their iron toys. France, for instance, was torn. On one hand, it was the birthplace of Voltaire, Rousseau, and 1,000 powdered philosophers who wrote passionately about liberty and reason. On the other hand, it still had a soft spot for public executions and the occasional judicial flogging. It was like watching someone read the social contract while casually sharpening a guillotine blade. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, and maybe just one more branding iron for old time's sake. Germany, meanwhile, was deep in its own existential crisis. The Holy Roman Empire was still technically a thing, though mostly in the way that your uncle's garage band is still, technically, together. Torture was still on the books in many German states, especially for those pesky crimes like witchcraft, heresy, or being a little too enthusiastic about astrology. Some regions began to phase it out, but others clung to it like a bad habit. "We'll stop torturing people," they said, "right after we finish this one last trial involving a goat, a thunderstorm, and a suspiciously well-read peasant." And then there was England. Oh, England, the land of Shakespeare, Newton, and habeas corpus, and also the occasional thumbscrew. Officially, torture was frowned upon. Unofficially, it was still used in those special cases, like treason, or when someone insulted the Queen's hat. The infamous Tower of London remained a sort of VIP lounge for elite-level suffering. "We don't do torture," they'd say, while quietly oiling the rack in the back room. It was all very hushed, very British. Torture with a cup of tea and a polite apology. But eventually, even these holdouts had to face the music. The Enlightenment was gaining ground, and the idea of torturing someone into telling the truth was starting to feel, well, a bit medieval. Legal reforms crept in. Judges began to prefer evidence over entrails. And the torture chambers, once bustling with activity, grew quiet, except for the occasional ghost tour. Yet torture didn't vanish. It simply changed addresses. Because while the courts were cleaning up their act, the world was expanding. Empires were growing. Wars were brewing. And somewhere, in the shadows of conquest and colonial ambition, the old tools found new hands. Torture shifts from law to war, empire interrogation, same pain, new paperwork. Once torture was kicked out of the courtroom, like an unruly guest who'd overstayed his welcome and broken a few ribs. It didn't vanish. It just packed its bags and moved into the shadows. The Enlightenment may have dimmed the torches in the dungeons, but empires were expanding, wars were brewing, and somewhere, someone was saying, "You know what this interrogation needs? A little medieval flair. Enter the age of empire, where torture found a new gag: colonial enforcement." Sure, it wasn't called torture anymore, too gotchy. Now it was enhanced questioning, disciplinary measures, or the ever-popular necessary persuasion. Same pain, new branding. It was like torture had hired a PR firm and rebranded itself as a strategic discomfort consultant. A colonial powers, France, Britain, Spain, the usual suspects, exported their legal systems, their flags, and unfortunately, their more creative interrogation techniques. In the colonies, where oversight was minimal and moral compasses were often left at home, torture flourished like a weed in the cracks of empire. "We're here to civilize," they said, while waterboarding someone for information about a goat theft. Then came the 20th century, and with it war. Big ones, global ones. And torture, ever the opportunist, slipped into military intelligence like it had a backstage pass. It was no longer about heresy or witchcraft. It was about information. Secrets, codes, resistance networks. Torture became a tool of espionage, counterinsurgency, and national security. It wore a uniform now. It had clearance. World War II, Vietnam, Algeria, Latin America during the Cold War. Each conflict brought new techniques, new euphemisms, and new justifications. Torture was no longer a public spectacle. It was a classified operation. No more town square floggings. Now it was black sites, soundproof rooms, and memos with lots of redacted lines. And let's not forget the modern era, where torture got a sleek new makeover in the war on terror. Hooded detainees, stress positions, sleep deprivation, and waterboarding made a comeback like a very dark reunion tour. Governments insisted it wasn't torture. It was enhanced interrogation. Because apparently, if you give it a fancy enough name, it stops being illegal and starts being policy. But the biggest change, it became secret instead of public. No more crowds. No more gallows. Just silence, shadows, and a very well locked door. Once upon a time, torture was a community affair. You'd grab a snack, bring the kids, and head to the town square to watch someone get publicly humiliated, flayed, or flambéed, all in the name of justice. But as the Enlightenment rolled in and people started using words like ethics and human dignity, torture got a bit shy. It didn't disappear. It just changed its outfit and slipped into the shadows. No more gallows in the square or racks in the cathedral basement. Now it was interrogation rooms with no windows. Secret prisons with names that didn't appear on maps. Governments still wanted answers. They just didn't want witnesses. Torture became a covert operation, wrapped in euphemisms like enhanced interrogation or non-standard techniques, which is bureaucrat speak for we're still doing it, but please don't look too closely. And the tools. Oh, they evolved. Out went the iron maiden, in came the rubber hose. Out went the branding iron, in came psychological warfare, sleep deprivation. And music played at volumes that can make even the most hardened suspect confess to stealing the moon. The public, meanwhile, was kept in the dark, sometimes willfully. Surely we don't do that anymore, they'd say, sipping their coffee and flipping past the headlines. But behind closed doors, in basements, with no clocks and walls that didn't echo, the old methods lived on, just with better lighting and more paperwork. Because while the world had changed, the desire to extract truth, or at least something that sounded like it hadn't, it just got quieter, cleaner, more deniable. But not all the old places were erased. Some dungeons still exist, with claw marks on the walls, and they remember everything. Yes, really, you can still find them, stone, walled, torch-lit, and smelling faintly of damp regret. These aren't movie sets or theme park attractions, though some have gift shops, suspiciously, close to the oubliette. These are the real deal medieval dungeons that once echoed with screams, prayers, and the occasional very awkward confession about consorting with goats, and the claw marks. Oh, they're there. Scratched into the stone by desperate hands, fingernails, or possibly someone who thought they could tunnel their way to freedom like a very determined mole. Some are faint, worn down by centuries of humidity and curious fingers. Others are disturbingly fresh, looking as if the walls themselves are still remembering. Tour guides love to point them out. And here, they'll say, shining a flashlight on a jagged groove, we believe a prisoner tried to escape using only his fingernails and sheer optimism. The group gasps. Someone takes a photo. A child asks if ghosts are real. The guide smiles and says, only on Tuesdays. These dungeons are scattered across Europe like grim little time capsules. In castles, under churches, behind taverns that now serve craft beer and artisanal cheese boards. Some are pristine, preserved like a macabre museum. Others are crumbling, with moss creeping in and bats who've claimed squatters' rights. But all of them whisper the same thing. Something terrible happened here, and now it's part of the tour. Because in the ultimate twist of historical irony, the same places where people once begged for mercy are now visited by people in cargo shorts holding audio guides. The same walls that heard confessions under duress now hear, "Honey, take a picture of me next to the rack." And so it goes. Tourists walk where men once screamed, and then they buy a magnet. It's a strange thing, really. How time turns terror into tourism. The same stone corridors that once echoed with the cries of the condemned now host guided tours, with laminated brochures and multilingual audio guides. To your left, the guide says cheerfully, "You'll see the rack." And to your right, the oubliette, French for the place where we forgot you existed. People shuffle through these dungeons in sensible shoes, snapping selfies beside iron maidens and posing next to manacles like they're at a Renaissance themed amusement park. Some even bring snacks. "Oh look, honey, this is where they used to flay people alive. Want a granola bar?" The walls, of course. Remember, they've soaked up centuries of fear, pain, and very bad decisions. But now they're scrubbed clean, lit with LD strips, and occasionally spritzed with lavender air freshener. The claw marks are still there, though etched into the stone by desperate hands. Most visitors assume they're part of the DA Corps. Wow, such attention to detail. And yet, something lingers. A chill in the air. A whisper that doesn't quite match the tour guide's script. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, someone, or something, is still watching. The guide chuckles nervously. Of course, none of it's haunted. They say, as the lights flicker for no reason. At night, when the tourists are gone and the corridors fall silent again, the dungeons breathe. Not literally, that would be horrifying, but in that way old places do, settling, creaking, remembering. And if you listen closely, you might hear something that isn't part of the audio tour. A whisper, a groan, a scratch. And that's when the guide smiles and says, "You'll never sleep again," they say. And somehow, you believe them. And they say it with a grin, right after leading you through a corridor where the walls still whisper, and the air smells like damp secrets. It's the kind of line that's meant to be cheeky, a little theatrical. Something to sell the experience. But then you lie in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and you realize they weren't entirely joking. Because once you've walked through those ancient halls, seen the claw marks, the rusted chains, the oubliette that's just a little too deep, you start to wonder, not just about the people who suffered there, but about the people who ran the place. The ones who built it, staffed it, maintained it like a particularly grim Airbnb. You wonder how many people it took to keep a torture chamber running smoothly. Answer more than you'd like. And then it hits you. This wasn't some rogue operation. It wasn't a secret cult or a hidden cabal of hooded weirdos. This was official, sanctioned, documented. There were receipts, there were job titles, there were budgets. The Iron Maiden had a line item. The rack had a maintenance schedule. The torturer had a pension plan. Because the real horror, the one that doesn't come with jump scares or flickering lights, isn't that these things happened. But the real horror, it was all legal, stamped, sealed, and blessed by crown and church alike, stamped by kings, sanctioned by popes, scribbled into law books with the same quills that signed marriage licenses and grain tariffs. Torture wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. It had rules, procedures, paperwork. There were official job titles like Master of Pain. Okay, not literally, but close enough. And entire manuals on how to extract confessions without technically killing anyone. Efficiency mattered. Optics, not so much. And that's the part that sticks with you. Not the spikes or the screams or the smell of damp stone. But the fact that all of it was done with a straight face and a wax seal. It wasn't chaos. It was order. A very loud, very painful kind of order. So the next time you walk through a castle dungeon, or see a rack behind velvet ropes, or hear a tour guide say, "This is where they questioned people," remember, it wasn't a rogue act of cruelty. It was policy. It was protocol. It was paperwork. And that, dear listener, is the final twist of the blade. Disclaimer time! We tried our absolute best to stick to historical facts, real records, and the occasional dusty Latin footnote. But history is messy, sources contradict each other, and sometimes medieval scribes had terrible handwriting. So if we accidentally said a rack was used in 1472, when it was actually 1473, please don't summon the ghost of a 15th century notary to correct us. We're only human. Well, you are. Now, close your eyes. Forget the claw marks. Ignore the whispering walls. And try not to think about the fact that your pillow is roughly the same shape as a medieval head clamp. Sleep tight. And if you hear chains rattling in the dark, it's probably just your cat. Probably.